Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, Rabbi.
Good Chodesh Tov. We are learning Mishnah's Pesachim. We are in Parakeh, chapter 5, and we are up to Mishnah Gimel, Mishnah 3. Okay, so the Mishnah continues now with situations of where your intentions can invalidate the carbon Pesach. We had examples of intentions, for the wrong carbon that invalidate the carbon Pesach, and now we're going to have other examples of that. So, shechatay shalei la'eichlav v'shalei l'menuyav. Let's say you slaughter the carbon Pesach for those who can't eat or for those who weren't included in it. Now, when it comes to carbon Pesach, you have to, so to speak, register before it's slaughtered. And a carbon Pesach is eaten in groups, right? It doesn't have to be every person eating his own carbon Pesach, eating in groups. So before the carbon Pesach is slaughtered, people basically decide, okay, we're eating this animal, right? This is going to be our carbon Pesach, right? They're registering on this carbon Pesach. And that's what you eat. That's what your carbon Pesach is going to be from. You're not allowed to eat from a different carbon Pesach that you didn't include yourself in. Okay, so that's the halacha. When you're talking about eating a carbon Pesach, it's got to be eating from the carbon Pesach that you, so to speak, registered to, that you counted yourself in on. Okay, we also have certain situations where people are not allowed to eat the carbon Pesach or can't eat the carbon Pesach. If you can't eat a kazayas, the amount of meat you have to eat from the carbon Pesach to fill your mitzvah is a kazayas, the volume of an olive, large olive, let's call it. If let's say a person is too sick or too ill or too young to be able to swallow, to eat a kazayas of the carbon Pesach, then they really can't do the mitzvah. So the Mishnah says like this: you had this carbon Pesach, and the first case is shechatay shalei la'eichlav. You shechted it, and your intention was to shech this carbon Pesach for people who can't eat it. And what that means is like this. That means that we're talking about here that the people who decided to eat on this carbon Pesach, the people who got together for this carbon Pesach, not one of them can eat the carbon Pesach. They're either too old or too sick to eat a kazayas. But that's the group. That's the group who came on this carbon Pesach. Now, really, that's not valid. You can't have a group like that. And this person knew of that group, and he still slaughtered the carbon Pesach for that group. If he wouldn't have slaughtered it for that group, if he could have said, this doesn't work, let's use it, let other people use it, would have been one thing. But that's not what he did. He said there was a group of people who included themselves in this animal with a carbon Pesach, and that's what he shechted it for, even though they weren't supposed to, even though that's not a valid group. Or shalei l'menuyav, he shechted it for people who weren't counted in on it. So basically, you're shechting it, and there's a group of people that have already registered and included themselves in this carbon Pesach, and he goes in and he thinks about people who aren't on it. He shechts it not for the people who are included on it, but for people who weren't included on it. That's what he did. Or la'arei l'tameim, he shechted the carbon Pesach for people who were not circumcised and have a bris milah, or for people who were impure. If a person doesn't have a bris milah, he can't eat from the carbon Pesach. That could even be so. There's a halacha that if, let's say, you have this baby, and two previous brothers of this baby died at the bris, that third baby doesn't need a bris. However, he's still an aro. He's still considered uncircumcised. Regardless, and therefore he cannot partake of the carbon Pesach. A person who is tamei, person come into contact with a sort of impurity, they're not allowed to eat any carbon. No different carbon Pesach, other carbon. They're not allowed to eat from any carbon. If they eat from a carbon, it's a chi of kares, a punishment of kares. So again, this guy is short of shechting carbon Pesach, and who's he shechting it for? Either for a bunch of people, for people who don't have a bris, or for people who are tamei. That's what he's doing. That's what he has in mind. Of course, he is not having the proper intention, but that's his intention as he shechted it. Paso, carbon Pesach, that animal, that carbon Pesach is invalid. Can't do anything with it. Can't use it for the carbon Pesach. Now, next case. Now, let's say he has in mind those who could eat and those who can't eat. Meaning you have this group on the carbon Pesach. Some of them are too old and some of them are too sick to eat from it. But the other ones are fine. So you got this mixed group. And he shechted it for both. Or l'menuyav or shalei l'menuyav. Or he had in mind when he shechted for those who were registered on the carbon Pesach and for those who aren't. That was his intention. He did it for both. Lemula mula reilim. let's say or let's say he had this carbon Pesach, and he had in mind to shechta for people who are circumcised and people who are uncircumcised. Let's maybe without the hirim, or had in mind to shechta for people who are impure and pure. Meaning, in this case, he's shechting it for some of the people that it's valid for. Some people it's not valid for. The halacha is kosher. Then it's kosher. As long as you have in mind those who can partake from it, it doesn't matter that you also had in mind those who cannot partake from it. Now, this is different than yesterday's case, where we had a situation where the person had in his mind both for Korban Pesach and for something else, right? He went ahead and he shechted it. Let's say part of the way he shechted for Korban Pesach, and the other half he started his shechita for Korban Pesach, and then he concluded his shechita for a Korban Shlomim. Doing both then doesn't help you, right? If once you have any kind of call it incorrect intention in yesterday's Mishnah, when you were doing it for a different carbon, it didn't help the fact you were also doing it for the Korban Pesach. And here we find that if at least some of the people are good, it doesn't affect the fact you're also doing it for those who aren't good. And the explanation given is because we're dealing with two kind of cases. In the case before, where you had in mind the wrong carbon, that's more serious than our Mishnah. Because in that situation, your incorrect intention is directly connected to the carbon itself. Meaning, instead of doing the carbon for Pesach, you did it for Shlomim. That is something that you're doing. That's something regarding the carbon itself. Here, the carbon's a carbon. It's a carbon Pesach. The problem is basically outside issues, right? Such as who's allowed to eat it or not. That's what's making the problems. That's less of an issue when it comes to this idea of intentions ruining your carbon Pesach. And therefore, as long as you intend for those who could partake from it, it's going to be kosher. Another interesting halacha I just want to mention to bring down here is that in this part of the Mishnah, the examples used are he shechted it for the people who can't eat. The same halacha applies if he caught the blood for people who can't eat. The same thing should seemingly apply to the other parts of the avodah, the other forms of the other parts of the worship, catching the blood, taking the blood, sprinkling the blood. But the Mishnah specifically here talked about shechting and didn't mention the other ones, unlike in the previous Mishnah where we mentioned all of them, because the case of shechting for those who cannot eat only applies, meaning for that intention for those who cannot eat, and we say that intention validates, that only validates by the shechita. If you shecht for those people who can't eat, this whole group of people who can't eat, that's what you shechted it for, invalid. But let's say you didn't shecht it for them. You shechted it for people who could eat. Mm-hmm. And then later on, when you're carrying the blood, taking the blood over, or sprinkling the blood, or catching the blood, then you said, oh, I'm doing it for those people who can't eat. Doesn't matter. It doesn't affect. The only time this intention of for those who can't eat affects is by shechita. But the other things for the people who are not included, or the uncircumcised, or the tamei, that would apply by any one of the stages of this of the worship that's done for the carbon. Okay, Mishnah continues. Shchat now. We mentioned before, the Korban Pesach has to be brought after the Tamid Shel Ben Arabayim, after the afternoon Tamid, the afternoon daily sacrifice. That's when it's supposed to be done. So now the Mishnah says, what if you didn't do it then? Let's say you did it before in some degree. So it has to be done after the carbon Tamid Shel Ben Arabayim, the afternoon Tamid, and now Mishnah is going to discuss what if you did it before. Shchatai kaidem chatzais. You shechted the Korban Pesach before midday. That early. Puzzle. Invalid. Mishna, because the pasuk states bein harabayim, afternoon. So you can't do it before chatzais. You can't do it before midday. Shchatai kaidem latamid. Let's say you shechted it before you shechted the carbon tamid. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to finish everything of the carbon tamid and then start the process, then start the carbon pesach. You didn't do that. You shechted it before you shechted the carbon tamid. That means you shechted the animal and you still have to shech the carbon tamid. So kosher. It's still kosher. Your carbon pesach can still be kosher. The fact that I shechted it before the carbon tamid doesn't invalidate the carbon pesach. However, but you got to stir the blood of the carbon pesach until after the blood of the carbon tamid is offered. Meaning, one thing for sure, you cannot go in and do the whole carbon Pesach. You cannot do the whole service of the carbon Pesach, or the blood service, let's call it, before the carbon tamid. You can't do that. You can't do that. You got to make sure. So you got to make sure that the carbon tamid is going to be completely taken. It's going to be completely taken care of, meaning its blood can be sprinkled before you sprinkle the blood of the carbon Pesach. If you were to sprinkle the blood of the, okay, that's what you're supposed to do. Okay, that's what you're supposed to do. So that means is like this: you shechted the carbon Pesach. Weren't supposed to, but you did. Now you got to catch the blood, right? You don't want to lose the blood, or else it's not going to be good. Okay, but you can't sit there and now we're telling you, okay, you caught the blood, but don't sprinkle the blood until the carbon tamid blood is sprinkled. That means until you shech the carbon tamid and you go ahead and you catch the blood and you take it over and you sprinkle it, which we said takes about an hour's time, right? We're telling you to wait. Don't do anything now. But if you leave the blood around too long and it congeals, then you can't use it for sprinkling the blood anymore for a carbon. So someone's got to sit there for an hour and mix it and make sure it doesn't congeal. And if that's what you should do. You shech the carbon tamid, you shech the carbon pass for the carbon tamid, catch the blood, stir the blood so that when the time comes to sprinkle the carbon Pesach blood after you've completed the whole carbon tamid, that's what you should do. Bim Nizrak, let's say you didn't do that. You sprinkle the carbon Pesach blood before the carbon tamid blood. Kosher, still kosher. So there's what you're supposed to be doing and what's after the fact. If you're supposed to be doing everything in the carbon Pesach after after the carbon tamid is completed. If you shechted it before you shechted the carbon tamid, the afternoon tamid sacrifice, catch the blood, stir it, and make sure it doesn't congeal. Do the whole carbon tamid service, and then sprinkle the blood of the carbon Pesach. And if you didn't wait for that, you sprinkle the carbon Pesach before you sprinkle the blood of the carbon tamid, it's still kosher. But if you shech the carbon Pesach before chatzais, before midday, puzzle, then it's no good. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
But the one that shechted